It's finally time to say goodbye to 2023. Another year of horror films has come and gone. Now, I'd love to say that it'd been fun. In actual fact, I think it's safe to say that this has really been one of the driest years in recent memory in terms of just consistently good new horror. I've definitely found myself watching a lot less new horror films this year than I have done in the past, really since I started this channel. I made it to 90 watches in 2023 before deciding to call it quits. Usually I do like to get to at least 100 watches in total as a rule, just to make sure that I'm giving the year in horror a fair crack, to make sure that I'm getting a chance to see as much variety as I possibly can. But really, with the way things were going this year, I think 90 is more than enough. But even though perhaps the overall standard of what I did see could definitely have been higher, that is not to say that there have not been some really good horror films released in 2023. And so today, I will be counting down my 10 personal favourite horror films of 2023. Now, first off, before we get started, let me just say this. I am a big fan of foreign horror films. At least half of the titles on this list are non-English language. And when it comes to release dates, especially with, you notice this a lot with Asian films particularly, quite a few of these picks were released in their native countries at some point last year, but then only got an English subtitled release in 2023. I do make it a point of really trying my best to see as many Asian and international horror films as I can every year, so I know from personal experience that in a lot of cases, though some of the picks on this list might technically be 2022 releases, there just simply was not the opportunity to watch any of these films with English subtitles until 2023, which is why they're on this year's list and not last year's. And that's really all I want to get out of the way up front. Other than just to say, for me personally, this was just a really odd year, and I do acknowledge that this is quite a strange list. And it's not one that I'm actually gigantically even that proud of, to be absolutely honest. I just don't think 2023 has had some of those real kind of genuine heavy hitter films like we've had in previous years. And I think if I was going to draw up a list of just the overall best horror films of the 2020s, the decade so far, there would be almost no 2023 films in there at all. I just don't think that a lot of these films that I'm going to be talking about today stand up when you compare them with the best of the last few years, which is kind of a shame. But enough negativity for now, because we're here to celebrate the films that wowed me in 2023. So pour yourself a drink of something strong, sit back, and let me take you through my own personal list of the best horror films of 2023, starting off with, at number 10, well, I started off last year's list with a Spanish film in the 10 spot, and this year, same deal, we're off to Spain for Killer Book Club at number 10 on this list. Yeah, this was a film I spoke about earlier in the year in my modern Spanish horror video. I said it was one of the best films of 2023 then, and I stick by that now. Killer Book Club is, for me, the best traditional slasher film of 2023. A really well put together stylish film with some great, smartly designed set pieces that manage to stage those familiar stalk and slash sequences in really fresh and interesting ways, all strung together with some very slick and adventurous direction and just really excellent camera work. Killer Book Club has got a great pace and an energy to it. It moves at speed from one kill to the next with a suitably large cast of victims, a very satisfyingly twisty backstory, no shortage of possible suspects, and a great full-blooded kind of taking itself serious big soundtrack that really amps up a lot of the big key dramatic moments. I had a really good time with Killer Book Club even on that repeat viewing. Because sometimes whodunit slashers like this just don't stand up once you get to that all-important reveal. And I actually think this might be one of the best looking films of the year as well, with this kind of gorgeous architecture and set design coupled with some really flashy, ballsy, exciting camera work. It's just a very solid film all round, very enjoyable, and oddly, it's also based on a book as well, which is quite unusual. Next up at number 9 is the only found footage film on this list, found footage / mockumentary. And that film is a sequel. It is part 4 in this particular series of films, and that is Hell House LLC Origins: The Carmichael Manor, which is also the longest title of the year. Now, I know found footage isn't necessarily everyone's cup of tea, but when they're done well, they can be very effective. The problem is that there just are so many shit found footage films out there that your chances of getting a decent one are very rare. That was certainly the case this year. And it's also, I think, because that style of films has its own very unforgiving set of inherent limitations. That's not to say that Hell House Origins doesn't have its own issues. It's got a lead character that is very annoying in a way that I'm not entirely sure she's meant to be. Some of the acting and the banter between the characters and the relationships with each other don't feel entirely genuine and come off as quite fake. And of course, there are definitely those moments when you find yourself wondering, why are they still filming this shit when they should just be running away as fast as they can? But Hell House LLC Origins earns a place on the list of the best films of this year, beating out some other stuff that's probably better than it in terms of just pure filmmaking, because it is one of the films this year that is just genuinely, legitimately scary. And not just once or twice, there's at least I think 3 or 4, maybe even 5 or 6 moments in this film that really do succeed in getting the blood pumping. Really, really well done scares that deliver the goods again and again. And I've got to give it credit, that is not something that's easy to do as well as this film does. There's no other film on this list that's as consistently effective in staging its scary moments as this. There's at least one other film, maybe 2 in this top 10, that's perhaps scarier in terms of just its ideas on an intellectual level, which, to be honest, is more the vogue in 2023 than just simple, good old-fashioned oh shit scariness, for better or worse. But Hell House Origins is the film that probably works the best purely as a traditional horror film that's just out to frighten you. Writer-director Stephen Cognetti has stuck with the Hell House series for all 4 installments to date as its sole creative force, and he's somebody that really knows how to make this stuff work to its best. These films are completely his babies, and the fact that the franchise is still going strong, still producing solid, effective sequels after all this time, I think is pretty damn impressive. So, number 8 on this list is a film that got its Blu-ray release this year. It was available to watch in Japan at some point last year, but it was only available in a subtitled form in 2023, and that is a little film called The Sound of Summer, put out by Unearthed Films. Yeah, so Sound of Summer, it's a very simple little film. It runs to just over 75 minutes, with a very small cast of characters and really a very straightforward premise. Basically, our lead character during a particularly hot and bothersome summer comes into contact with a mysterious cicada-obsessed guy, and very quickly she begins to grow paranoid that somehow he's planted cicada eggs inside of her body whilst she was asleep, and that now they're hatching out inside of her, which leads to some very grisly scenes of self-mutilation as she becomes more and more psychologically unstable. Now, I'm a big fan of really squirmy, under-your-skin body horror, and that is exactly what Sound of Summer is. It's a film which goes from being this nice, bright, slice-of-life, feel-good workplace comedy into this intense, disturbing, horrific nightmare in a very short space of time. It's absolutely an indie effort, it's low budget, and a little bit rough around the edges, admittedly, neither of which are things that I personally have got a problem with, because I feel that this film is incredibly effective in doing what it sets out to do, and it's got some really twisted, artfully surreal moments, as well as, at its core, an idea that really works in that it's impossible not to get a little bit freaked out by. And whilst I have definitely seen and enjoyed in the past much gorier and more explicit Japanese films, this one keeps the violence on a very intimate and personal level. You pretty much feel each and every scratch, each and every tear, each and every drop of blood being spilled, which does make it the kind of film that's full of those uncomfortable look-away moments. And whilst I do realise that this kind of film just doesn't appeal to everyone, for me, Sound of Summer is one of those films that manages to pull off an awful lot, to construct its own unique little world and bring to life this very unique vision with very little in the way of resources. And that's something that I am always impressed by. Next up, at number 7, is a film called Moon Garden. Now, this is a really intriguing little film. It's this highly atmospheric, nightmarish phantasmagoria that tells the story of a young child that falls into a coma, who then has to journey through this terrifying fantasy landscape in order to make her way back to consciousness. Her struggles with the creatures of her surreal dreamscapes, a metaphor for her fighting to stay alive in the real world. Now, what Moon Garden lacks in the subtlety of its metaphors, it more than makes up for with its absolutely wonderful sincerity, its story about hope and love and loss. Our protagonist could not be any sweeter and more angelic, and is in actual fact played by the director's real-life daughter, and yet Moon Garden is far from sappy or trite. It's this really gloomily lit fairy tale grounded in a very real, truthful sadness, in a child's fears of her parents arguing and being torn apart, and her feelings of helplessness and insignificance in the face of this terrible, overwhelming emotional distress. There's a very bleak and scary feel even to the scenes that are set in the real world, just because it's so genuinely emotionally harrowing seeing those scenes play out from a child's point of view. But when we finally enter the fantasy worlds of Emma's fever dream wonderland, that's where the magic really starts, and we get some of the most imaginative, inventive and beautifully artful flights of fantasy committed to film in quite some time. Moon Garden might be the most sumptuously designed film of the year, but for all of its wonderful, painterly visuals and its highly stylised, gorgeously staged set pieces, it still relies every bit as heavily upon its human moments. It remembers to touch your heart as it goes, rather than just thrusting a bunch of stuff at you that looks cool. And that's why I think Moon Garden is just so tremendous, because for all of its wonderfully macabre and gloomy visuals and its dreamlike atmosphere, both of which alone are more than reason enough to recommend this film, it really does look and feel just like nothing else that came out this year. It never loses sight of the things that really matter, the real heart that you need in a story like this. At number 6 on this list, we've got our second Japanese film so far, which is a film called either Remember Member or Re/Member, or even Karada Sagashi if you want to split hairs. And it's a great little film, whatever you choose to call it. We follow a group of students waking up to find themselves in school at the dead of night. Exactly why they're there, none of them know. Very quickly, they find themselves being hunted down and picked off one by one by this deadly, unseen force. 24 minutes into the film, and wow, the entire cast have all been mercilessly butchered. Cut to our lead then waking up again and finding that she's now stuck in a time loop where she and a motley crew of her classmates have to put to rest the spirit of a dead girl that's haunting them by finding her earthly remains, which have been scattered throughout the school. Night after night, they end up getting killed by the increasingly monstrous spirit, but each time they get a little further in unravelling the mystery of what happened to this girl in the first place. And along the way, they come to terms with their own mortality and learn to live their lives to the fullest, because sometimes their classmates don't come back the next night. Remember Member is based on a manga series, and the film version is directed by Eiichiro Hasumi, who also directed the Resident Evil Death Island animated film that came out this year that was admittedly quite fun. He does a great job of really infusing this film with a kind of infectiously lively, poppy, fast-paced, boisterous sort of energy and charm, and he transforms a very interesting supernatural time loop mystery into a story about seizing the day and making every second of your life really count. There's some very effectively creepy moments in the school at night, and some very eccentric and memorable creature designs. But really what I think makes Remember Member work so well is its huge heart, its charming and sweet romantic elements, and its story of misfits working together and becoming friends united in the face of a terrible adversity. It's a really sweet coming-of-age film full of just heart and humanity, with a very charming and charismatic young cast that rarely ever puts a foot wrong. So if you're sick and tired of just unrelentingly bleak, nihilistic horror films, then Remember Member is one of those films that will restore your faith in humanity and put a smile in your soul. Getting into the top 5 of the year, and at number 5 we've got the film that I have seen more times this year than anything else on this list, and that film is, of course, Megan. Now, this is one of those films where, to be honest, I again had zero expectations for going in. I was worried by how much this film was being sold as just this kind of meme, that it would just be another daft killer doll film.
It does look like shit.
But Megan has really got a lot more going for it than you'd have any right to expect. It's a film that by rights just shouldn't work, but it really does. It really takes its time to set up its characters and their relationships in an intelligent way. It takes the time to let Megan be a character that you're rooting for initially, knowing full well how this is going to turn out. And it's actually that rare, modern mainstream film that's aimed at basically a teen audience that's incredibly critical of technology and of its adverse effects on the development of children. I love just how ruthless this film is in critiquing those lazy, modern, stick 'em in front of a screen parenting attitudes. I love that it's a story about our lead character basically being punished for emotionally neglecting a child under her care, and learning that doing so has consequences. It's a fiercely humanist cautionary tale about the battle for the future of our children and how important it is not to hand over future generations to the care of seemingly benevolent labour-saving technology. And to me, that's always a story that's worth telling, one that gets more and more relevant with each passing year. And on a much more basic level, I also just love how subtly creepy the design of that Megan character is. How you get those moments of her just sitting and staring, and how you can just look at this totally blank face and it's really unsettling because you know she's not really this sweet, smiley character that she at first appears. It's a film that really takes its time. It doesn't just rush to the big obvious killer doll stuff that you'd expect, to the point that when Megan does finally snap at about the hour mark, it really does feel earned. In actual fact, I do have one very odd criticism of this film, which I think is kind of the opposite of what I think most people say about this, which is I actually think that this is a film that works better in its theatrical cut than it does in the unrated one, because I think sticking more gore into this really adds nothing, because again, much like with Five Nights at Freddy's, what I really like about Megan is the fact that it's not just a killer doll slasher film. It's much more about this subtle, cuckoo-in-the-nest battle of wits. And I think all the very best moments in this film are not just the obviously memeable TikTok bits, but they're the little creepy head turns from Megan, or just blank looks, or pivotal moments when you suddenly realise that Megan is much more in control than you think she is at first. If you watched Megan and your thought was, this film would be good if it had more gore in it, then there's a chance that you're maybe not watching the right film. Now, gore in horror films is great, but not every horror film is improved with just more bloodshed. But really, Megan is just, for me, one of this year's big standouts. Megan herself, just the character, is arguably even the single most durable horror image to come from 2023. Her design itself is just a real classic, to the point where I'd argue that she's actually almost instantly recognisable as a character in herself, which I think makes her the best original horror icon of 2023. And I think that wouldn't be the case, that there wouldn't have been such good word of mouth, that there wouldn't be sequels in the pipeline even now, if this just wasn't such a good film in the first place. Megan is proof that ultimately there is still an audience out there for good, original, intelligent mainstream horror films. Next up, at number 4, we have got a film from Thailand, and that is Faces of An. Now, Faces of An has got an absolutely fascinating plot. We open up with a young woman waking up knowing nothing about herself or where she is, only that her name is Anne. Perhaps she's in a hospital, perhaps it's an asylum, perhaps it's a prison, no idea. Anyway, as Anne tries to find out who she is, the big twist is that every few minutes the actress playing Anne changes, obviously to massively disorientating effect. Now, is she going crazy? Is she dealing with extreme dissociative personality disorder? Are all of the different Annes just manifestations of different aspects of her personality? Or is there something much more sinister going on? Throw in this deadly deer-headed demon that stalks the halls at night, a twisty, complex time loop plot device that sees different Annes coming together to relive the same series of events, only to end up brutally murdered, and a series of these really interesting, recurring, haunting fragments of memories and ideas interspersed into this kind of crazy paving mosaic of a film, and you have got one of the most perfectly put together films of 2023. There's elements in this of The God Complex and Heaven Sent, of John Carpenter's The Ward, and even Sam Keith's The Max, which is just absolutely fantastic, but they're just all echoes of individual ideas, not self-referential copy-pasting. This is a film that absolutely works on its own and feels entirely original in its construction. The whole film really is just this beautifully designed, wonderfully written, melancholic, highly atmospheric puzzle box of a film that's brought to life by perhaps the single greatest gathering of Thai genre actresses ever brought together for one film. It's a film as well of just immense humanity and sadness, not just some cerebral putting together the pieces exercise that you might expect it to be. It's films like Faces of An that are why I'm just so in love with Thai horror cinema these days, and this is easily, I think, one of the best Thai horror films I've ever seen. In fact, even though we're only at number 4, there's an argument that this is a more impressively put together film than any of the other picks on this list. There's really, I think, almost nothing wrong with Faces of An whatsoever. At number 3, we've got a film that I reviewed earlier this year. It is the final Japanese pick of 2023, and it is, of course, Keiichi Kondo's amazing New Religion. Now, this was one of the few films of 2023 that I knew from the moment I first watched it was absolutely going to end up on my top 10 list. It's a strange, surreal, doom-laden film about a young woman dealing with the loss of her child and eventually becoming kind of slowly unstuck before eventually allowing herself to become reborn in a new and terrifying fashion. Now oddly, it's the second Japanese film on this list to feature a young isolated female protagonist being psychologically preyed upon and beaten down by a sinister dude with an unhealthy insect obsession. Which is admittedly quite strange, but whereas Sound of Summer was a quirky, kind of odd, flinchy body horror thing, New Religion is a masterpiece of much more subtly ominous, unsettling, portentous horror, full of these big, terrifying existential ideas that are almost too vast to fully grasp in their entirety, this kind of pure, cosmic, Lovecraftian dread. New Religion features what is, in my opinion, the best ending of any horror film this year in terms of just being genuinely, blood-curdlingly terrifying. It's got one of the best soundtracks of any film this year, and some of the most memorably unique visuals, as well as just loads of really incredible ideas brought together in a very interesting and unconventional way that really kind of emphasises that rich, atmospheric sense of kind of almost nightmare logic.
Well, I'll take a pinch of that shit.
It is on the whole definitely somewhat slower paced as a film in that it's more kind of about this ambient atmosphere than it is any particular events. I think the pace was probably the big issue that I had with it initially when I first watched it, but I think once you know what sort of speed the whole film plays out on, watching it a second or a third time, that definitely becomes, I think, less of an issue. But nonetheless, New Religion, I think, is the single scariest horror film of 2023. It's perhaps even just purely, I think, from a technical standpoint, if you don't factor in personal favourites, which is something that I do, maybe the best made horror film of the year, and I think it's definitely one that's going to stick with me for a long time as being just one of the best new horror films in a long while. At number 2 on this list comes, I think, what's probably going to be the biggest surprise of the year. Not because it's a film that's on this list that I wasn't expecting to be, but because this is my number 2 pick. When, to be honest, I think all the signs look like it was gonna be odds-on favourite for my number 1 pick. And to be honest, maybe in some ways it is my favourite horror film of 2023, but for now, in my opinion, there is another film that's knocked this one down to the number 2 spot. And if you've been around my channel this past year, then you'll probably know where I'm going with this, because at number 2 is the film that I talked about more than anything else in 2023, and that is Saw X. Obviously, I loved Saw X. It's the film that I was definitely the most excited for in 2023. This, and actually Brandon Cronenberg's Infinity Pool, which, spoiler alert, is not on this list because I was actually massively disappointed in that film. And I think in terms of just purely which films are going to stick with me the most from 2023, Saw X is probably the popular choice. It's the film that I'm going to end up watching more than any of these other films just because I absolutely love Saw. I just love the Saw films. I've watched them over and over again, even the ones that aren't particularly that good, and my love for the franchise is not going anywhere anytime soon. And of course, Saw X is a film that slots into my personal favourite horror franchise very nicely. It is a really, really good Saw film. Tobin Bell is absolutely magnificent, Shawnee Smith is just amazing, there's so much that's just right about the look and the feel of Saw X that it just absolutely captures that golden era of when we had a new Saw film every year. It doesn't feel like some kind of awkward throwback that can't quite remember what it was that made the original film so much fun in the first place. It just feels like another really good Saw film, and you really can't understate just quite how difficult that must have been to get. And it's a Saw film with some of the best Tobin Bell stuff of any film in the series, and that is just absolutely amazing. I've sung Tobin Bell's praises in the past again and again, and he absolutely deserves that praise. I loved Saw X, but it's not my favourite film of 2023. So, the big question is, what's my number one then? Go on, have a guess. Just randomly pause the video without cheating and just try and guess what my number one is. I guarantee there's absolutely no fucking way that any of you are going to guess what this is. Because it's a film that I have seen pretty much no buzz for whatsoever. It is a sleepy little Shudder release that came out, I think, about April or May-ish. It is a very British little horror comedy, believe it or not, that goes by the name of Manfish. Yep, that's right, I am completely not taking the piss with this. Manfish is my favourite horror film of 2023. It is better than Saw X, it is better than New Religion or Faces of Anne, or all the rest of the films on this list. Manfish is a film that I have absolutely no issues with whatsoever. It's very funny, it's very sad, it's heartwarming, it's weird as fuck, it's very British and very independently spirited in the truest sense of the word. It's pretty much about as unblockbuster-like as it's possible to be, and most importantly of all, it is a film full of heart and humanity and passion. Now, if you haven't seen Manfish, and there's a good chance that you probably haven't, then basically it's kind of a gay Shape of Water set in a small British seaside town, is probably, I think, the easiest way of summing it up, although, of course, that really doesn't do it justice. It is a very literal fish-out-of-water love story between a poor put-upon bloke called Terry, who dreams of finding some happiness in his bleak and meaningless life, and a rubber-suited fishman that washes up on the beach one day, who very quickly becomes the symbol of all of Terry's hopes and dreams. It's a film about a tragically lovable character stuck in an uncaring world that offers him nothing but cruelty, suddenly finding out that there's something beautiful out there, something that gives him a reason to live and a reason to fight for what he believes in. It's just such a sweet film, but in such a really kind of unsappy, unpretentious way. This kind of grubby, self-conscious, Pritt-stick, dirty dog ends love story, full of a very self-deprecating, earnest, sincere warmth and humanity. It's a film full of these grubby, eccentric, larger-than-life, weird British characters, all really acted to perfection in this charmingly deadpan kind of kitchen sink way that really helps this film feel like the magic realist fable that it is. I think Dean Kilby as Terry, our lead character, gives the best performance of anyone in any film of 2023, aided by a fantastic supporting cast including Emma Stannard and even Big Mad Andy himself.
Am I mad?
As a bottle of twats.
No.
To be honest, and I know this might sound like I've gone completely insane, but in terms of, I think, just the big obvious comparison, I think Manfish genuinely is a better film than The Shape of Water, because it feels so much more genuinely truthful in what it's setting out to do, and because it doesn't feel the need to keep hitting you over the head with its character's outsiderness. Now, I do really like Shape of Water. I think Sally Hawkins is one of the best actresses working today, but Shape of Water was really anything but subtle in its messaging, and it had this really kind of painfully arch, self-aware streak of basically pretentiousness to it that I think left you coming away with a sour taste, and it compromised what should have been a genuinely beautiful love story. Manfish, by comparison, is a much purer construct, and I've got nothing but praise for it. The kind of film that just leaves you feeling a lot less shitty about life in general, because it makes you realise that there are still genuine, independent, free-spirited filmmakers out there, uncorrupted by all of the shit in today's world, that just want to dream. Manfish is a true, timeless piece of work. It is just horror enough to be on this list, admittedly. There is a fish monster, there is gore, there are some darker moments, and it is, I'm happy to say, my personal favourite horror film of 2023. For sure. So, with that said, let's get out of here. This has been more than long enough. 2023 is long since over, and we're already up and running with a new year of weird and wonderful horror films to come. So, join us for much more horror shit in 2024. Let me know what you think of any of these films if you have seen them. Throw me any recommendations of good stuff you've seen lately, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you back here for the top 10 of 2024 about this time next year. It's got to be better, surely.